Okay, well, I'm going to start. So welcome everyone to the UN Food System Summit Resilience Track 5 forum, which we have organized today to really open up some of our thinking, exchange with you, and start to put forward some of the key questions that we have in the resilience track. My name is Sandrine Dixon de Cleve. I am the vice chair, working alongside Professor Salim Ul-Houk as the chair of the resilience track, and my youth vice chair, Mike Kunga, and also Stephanie Hochstetter, who is representing the World Food Programme and a very important anchor of the work in which we are undertaking together. We are here today, as I said, because we very much wanted to make sure that as the resilience track, we reached out to a broader group of interested actors, stakeholders within the food system, both action and also conversation, to ensure that as we move forward and prepare for the UN Food Summit, we are not only asking the right questions, but unpacking the key tensions and understanding where resilience building is today within the system itself, but also clearly its links with the convergence of the tipping points that we see between climate change, biodiversity loss, and prosperity in people. The fact that we know very clearly that access to food, as we are within and coming out of in some regions, the COVID crisis, is absolutely key. That we know that access to food when under stress points, whether it be through climate change or biodiversity loss or through security issues due to war and conflict zones, is also key. Therefore, we see this track as a very important complementary and cross-cutting track to the other action tracks that are working within the UN Food Systems Summit family ecosystem of trying to unpack not only the key problems, but come forward with core solutions and actions for moving forward. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our core team. As I indicated, Professor Salim Oak will be actually leading through some of this presentation. We would like to start off with giving you an indication of some of the key questions that we're already asking, the key content that we would like to look at, and some of the different organizations and thought leaders that are working with us already as we speak. Then we, as I said, also have our youth vice chair, very important for the youth and different regions to be properly represented within our conversations. And we feel within the Resilience Hub, absolutely fundamental in terms of understanding solutions for future generations. And then, as I indicated, our anchor agency, and that anchor agency, the World Food Programme, within the resilience track, is being led by Stephanie Hochstetter. So Stephanie is taking a very key role in helping us as we unpack some of these questions. Next slide, please. What is our team composition made of? So far, what we have done is gone through a process of understanding, first of all, which key stakeholders should be part of the core team, and secondly, where do we need to focus our attention?
Driver called to us what time? I said 8 o'clock.
Good.
Sorry, Salim, can you just put yourself on mute?
Sorry.
Thank you. So the team composition, also recommended by the UN, and the other action tracks have moved in a very similar way, is that we are looking at, first of all, proper gender diversity. So clearly we've got a good gender diversity, gender balance, and not quite parity, but we're almost there in terms of the team composition. We are trying to get as representative, cross-cutting, multidisciplinary approach as possible within the stakeholders. So we have 15 civil society leaders and members who are part of this team, 32 academics, and then science, youth, think tanks, private sector, and of course, UN representatives. So you can see that within the stakeholders, and because also we very much within the resilience track feel it's important to find ourselves and to anchor ourselves within sound science, that we also have a very strong academic showing, but also moving forward in terms of understanding what some of the key dilemmas are and how we unpack those. And then the geography is absolutely fundamental. We cannot be a northern focused group of thought leaders within the resilience track and actors. We must actually have proper representation. And this is actually formulated in two ways in terms of our activities. One is within the geography of the team itself. So as you can see here, there is a good split between different regions, but also in terms of the interaction that we will have continuously with different countries as we move through the process. So it's very important that we work with different policymakers and different ambassadors for different countries, both in terms of understanding what their key issues are, but also that we have proper representation within the team composition itself within the resilience track. Next slide, please. So what I would like to do now is pass over the floor to Professor Salim Hook, who will lead you through now some of our core thinking that we have undertaken so far, where we are in terms of the resilience track. That will then be held over to Mike Kunga, who will continue the presentation. And then we will go into a series of very short cameo presentations from our science group, our climate thinking, our innovation thinking and leader, gender and finance. So Salim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for that excellent introduction. It's my pleasure now to take you through the next set of slides and then hand over to our Youth Vice Chair, Mike Kunga, to finish this presentation. So the number of themes that we have identified here, you can see on the left panel, are conflict, weather extremes, economic shocks, and epidemics, obviously COVID-19 being a very good example of the last one. And we at the same time have identified a set of enablers in the middle panel. The first one being partnerships, extremely important for us in this event from our point of view, is exactly to reach out to potential partners. We hope each of you who are participating in this meeting with us will continue to engage with us and bring your own insights and knowledge and help us as our partners as we take forward the Action Track 5 on resilience of the UN Food System Summit. The second one is innovation. We are looking very much for out-of-the-box, game-changing ideas or pilots that people are doing that can be scaled up and looking at how we can scale those up. So if any of you are involved in any of these or know of them, we would very much welcome your inputs. We are seeking advice and information on game-changing ideas and activities. So we hope very much to hear from you on those. And then the third one is on synergy, particularly across the 5 action tracks. So as you know, we have 5 different action tracks in the Food System Summit. We're extremely aware that we don't want to remain in silos, that many of the things overlap between the action tracks. And we have a very, very strong coordination to ensure that we have synergies across the action tracks going forward. And then the fourth and final enabler is an empowerment of the most vulnerable. This is something that is very dear to my personal heart. I work, my day job is working on helping the most vulnerable communities and countries to the impacts of climate change, which is very relevant for the action track on resilience of the Food System Summit. And so empowerment of the most vulnerable, both at the production end, small farmers and fishers in the developing world, as well as at the consumption end, people living in cities and in slums in the developing world as well, who are consuming the food that the farmers produce. So a very important element for us. And if anybody amongst the participants works on these issues, we would love to have you engage with us going forward. We have divided ourselves into three working groups. These are looking at the economic vulnerability or resilience, social vulnerability or resilience, and then environmental vulnerability and resilience. Again, realizing that these are not watertight compartments, but are rather synergistic across them. And so we are very aware that there will be a need for cutting across them, but these are likely to be the three subgroups under which we will be operating our broader action track group. Next slide, please. So just to very quickly identify some of the problems that we are starting with, sort of the lay of the land or the current situation, we see that the conflict, weather, and economic shocks are a major part of food and nutrition imbalances and shortages, and indeed even famines in some parts of the world in the countries. The left bar shows you some of the countries that are the most affected by the impacts of food insufficiency. And then if you look at the right, the pie chart shows you the causes, and you're seeing an increasing number of, obviously, conflicts is a major one, weather extremes is another one, and economic shocks are another one. So over the next decade, food systems are predicted to face a complex set of challenges to deliver sufficient, safe, and nutrition food for all in the context of crisis management and sustainable development. So we have the extremes of crises in parts of the world on the one hand, and ensuring sustainable development for the all the other countries on the other hand, which is the uh, the issue that we have to try and address going forward. Next slide, please. So further on the agriculture systems and their vulnerabilities, I should mention that we will be having a new set of slides with more updated scientific information from our science group. But just a quick assessment of the fact that agriculture is declining, the proportion of people involved in agriculture is declining, and in the lower set of chart, we can see that the impacts of uh, various kinds of impacts, particularly of climate change over time, are going to be extremely adverse. So the shocks and impacts are going to go up. A potential agriculture production might go down, although again, these are subject to quite significant caveats, which our science group will be able to update on as we go along. Next slide, please. So I will end this slide with this slide and hand over to the Vice Chair, Mike Kunga, to finish this presentation. But basically what we are looking at right now is an extremely complex and acute situation which has been made worse by COVID-19. And on the one hand, it has shut down informal food markets, making informal food suppliers and workers highly vulnerable. At the same time, there's a global recession, which is a serious threat for hundreds of millions of people already living on the cusp of hunger and malnutrition, as well as extreme poverty. The World Food Programme has estimated or projected that COVID-19 will increase the number of acutely food insecure people to 265 million from 135. That's practically doubling them. And then finally, industrial farming systems have proven to make themselves at increasing high risk of livestock production, which tends to amplify risks of diseases and disease emerging and spreading like the COVID-19. So COVID-19 is not just a health crisis, but also a food crisis coming on top of a climate crisis. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed huge vulnerabilities and inequalities in food systems. And the food systems are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change going forward even further through droughts, floods, typhoons, sea level rise. So in the short term, we have to deal with the outcomes of the COVID-19 and ride that storm. But in the longer term, we have a much bigger storm coming, which is climate change that we will have to deal with. So with that, let me hand over to Mike Kunga to finish the presentation from our side. Mike, you have the floor.
Hi everyone. As Salim and Sandrine have already introduced me, my name is Mike Kunga. I'm the Youth Vice Chair for Action Track 5. I'm very honored to be here, of course, as a young person. At the same time, I'm also appreciative of the involvement of my fellow within all the action tracks. So what do we want to achieve in Action Track 5? In the first place, we understand that to achieve resilience in terms of food system, we need to take up a holistic approach, understanding the multi-stakeholder and multi-sector approach in achieving achieving food resilience. At the same time, our ambition behind achieving this is to ensure that food system from land and even to waste are regenerative and circular, where possible. That's more resilience to future shocks. And also, we also understand a comprehensive approach that integrates responses to climate, biodiversity loss, conflicts, epidemics, and economic crisis. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. As Salim already said, that we have divided our working group into 3 main categories: the economic resilience, social resilience, as well as the environmental resilience. So on economic resilience, we are looking at being equitable and inclusive, while on social resilience, we also focus on producing broad-based benefits for all people, at the same time generating positive and regenerative impact on the natural environment. At the same time, in order and for us to achieve all this, we are factoring in context specificity, at the same time fostering innovation and strengthening partnership. Next slide. So what needs to be done? So solutions need to be defined defined around cross-cutting levers, as I talked of multi-sector and the stakeholder involvement. At the same time, we also understand that there has to be a systematic approach in terms of achieving resilience in our food systems. And these there has to be strongly coordinated at country and even at regional level, ensuring that governments and political leaders take a leading role in achieving resilience in the food system around regions and even at country level. Context specificity is also very key, approaching with the understanding of culture and environment and social context. At this time, we also realize that culture and environment context play a very huge role in order to achieve resilience in the resilience of the food systems. Next slide. So food system transformation require coordination, as I talked of multi-sector and multi-sector approach, intervention that can only be achieved through strong partnership and shared outcomes. We understand that when we're talking of food system, it cannot be only one person, or we cannot work in silos, as my friends have already said. So all key players have to be involved, starting farmers from the ground in the field, producing nutritious food. At the same time, scientists have to come in, developing ideas, developing new genes, developing new seeds and the like, and even investors coming in to make sure that food systems are resilient, and even government coming into in terms of policies which can make sure that our food system is very effective and also supportive. And even food suppliers, all these key players have to come in terms of the distribution, the processing of food and the like. Next slide. So various actions have to be taken to support food system resilience, which should not be less focused to investing in holistic food system approaches, addressing joint people, planet, and prosperity aims. At the same time, ensuring that there's equal access and utilization of resources, knowledge, assets, technology, and markets. And also at the same time, making sure that risk and security, mitigation and management are highly prioritized at all levels, starting at individuals, at community, and across all the systems. The risk and security should be prioritized. So also focus on strengthening capacity and resources of stakeholders, including all the indigenous groups, women and young people, as you see me, effectively engage in all points of food system from producers to consumers. Identifying and addressing, all right, yeah, so strengthening and increase capacity to monitor, measure, and analyze vulnerability. This is also so key when you're trying to make sure that our food system is resilient. We need to strengthen the capacity to monitor and analyze vulnerability across all the region and across all countries. Next slide. Well, so far reaching this far, I really appreciate that you have been with us in terms of in the presentation. And I wish you a very, very fruitful discussion. Let us be complementary. Let us put our ideas together in order to achieve food systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And for everyone who's listening, poor Mike often has bandwidth problems. And I think actually we did okay this time, Mike. So it's really great that you were able to contribute in the presentation. It's not always easy because we are truly global right now. If everyone that's calling in is calling from very different places. So do give us your patience and your indulgence if some of the bandwidth issues kick in. Many of you are already starting to ask questions, and we are both in the chat and the Q&A trying to answer them as we go forward. So again, please do put your questions forward and we will do our very best to engage with you, as that is what this forum is all about. I would like to now move over to presenting some of the key people that we will be engaging with that are part of our team, in particular the science group that is being led by Ismahane Blois and also Thomas Hertel. And Thomas is here to present some of the science group's findings, very important for us. And then we'll move into some of the key cross-cutting representation that we have in our team. Please, Tom, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, just trying to maximize the screen here. There we go. Well, it's my pleasure to present on behalf of the Science Committee. We're playing an advisory role in this process and focusing on building resilience along the theme of Action Track 5. So one challenge is just defining resilience. There are many ideas about what this is. We've chosen to follow the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition, which indicates that resilience is the ability prevent disasters and crises, and to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from them in a timely, efficient, and sustainable manner. So think about COVID-19. This is exactly the kind of thing that people are thinking about when they're worried about resilience of the food system in this context. So these significant challenges have already been nicely laid out. The pandemics, the conflict of food insecurity, it reaches its greatest intensity in conflict zones these days, and this is exacerbated by demographic pressure, growing populations in the poorest parts of the world, climate change, and biodiversity loss. So achieving these multiple goals is going to require leveraging synergies, navigating trade-offs, and that's what we focus much of our discussion on. I'd like to highlight a few of these trade-offs that we've been thinking about and scanning the literature for insights into. The first of these just relates to the trade-off between wanting to feed more people and therefore potentially expand, intensify agriculture on the one hand. On the other hand, this very expansion of agriculture is creating stresses, sustainability challenges, whether it's biodiversity loss, groundwater drawdown, and so on. There are also significant competition for resources between agriculture and other parts, other communities. Rural and urban communities sometimes compete for water or land, but these are also synergistic opportunities here. We've seen during the COVID crisis, as with some previous crises, people moving back to rural areas temporarily in order to withstand the crisis. And of course, in other times, people migrate from rural to urban areas in order to diversify income. And these are all beneficial for resilience. Another important trade-off is that related to international trade and globalization. Globalization has been beneficial in the context of the COVID crisis because we've been able to offset food deficits in some areas by increased imports. This also very much in the context of extreme weather events, one of the important adaptations to those events is increased trade. On the other hand, increased globalization does expose local producers to international markets and uncertainty in those markets. So there are trade-offs there. These are more challenging in the context of marginal areas where biophysical market constraints, poverty traps make it very difficult for people to become resilient. So we are thinking about, in our background paper, a variety of measures that can be taken to enhance resilience. One of those is investment in information systems. World Food Program and others are involved with early warning systems that are important for assisting in flagging where food insecurities may arise. Also, transnational regulatory networks, such as exists now in the Sahel region, to ensure food security and health related to agriculture, that these regulations are standardized and enforced. Institutional innovation is very important in this case. I just want to give a shout out to WFP's P4P program in Ethiopia. Just this week, a publication came out, a scientific evaluation of that program, showing that this strengthening of farmer organizations in Ethiopia has generated short-term benefits for households, but also long-term, improved long-term investment in children's education. So important institutional innovations and investments being made. Most of the investment around the world that will be relevant for the food system in the future will be made by private sector institutions, and coordinating those with public investments will be important. It's important also to think about the interactions between agriculture and natural systems and the potential mutualism. It's not just competition, but there's potential mutual interests. For example, strengthening natural ecosystems can benefit, for example, natural pollinators. These can improve yields, and there can be a mutualism in this context that can be very beneficial for resilience. Of course, there'll need to be significant investments in marginal areas. Disadvantaged individuals who are most vulnerable need to be made more resilient. And finally, as Mike indicated previously, these solutions are going to have to be context specific, and there is no one size fits all solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. There's a question now in the chat, which I want to take at this point because I think it's very important. There are several people who have asked, what is the role of the scientific community? Is it cross-cutting? Now, I have indicated that each of the tracks actually have identified scientists like yourself and Ismahane who are helping us. And we have other core scientists that will support us. Could you give just a very short reaction to that question, Tom, with regard to how the scientific committee is feeding into the overarching track thinking and also the UN Food Summit in general?
That's a great question. And this is indeed an innovative part of the Food System Summit that our chair, Joachim von Braun, based in Germany, has reached out to several dozen scientists around the world. As you can see in our particular subcommittee, they're individuals from various parts of the world, different genders, different backgrounds, different scientific specialties. We have this whole group, Scientific Advisory Committee, has broken up into subcommittees. This is our subcommittee, supporting each of the action tracks. And we have drafted papers, which are available on the website, that are aimed at supporting the work of the action track. And these are currently being revised and will be reposted. So they are designed to better inform the kind of stakeholder engagement that's going on today. Thanks for including me in this discussion.
And it's such a pleasure to have you, Tom. And I think, again, it's especially for the resilience track, the underpinning science and data around the key stress points is so fundamentally important for us to better understand resilience. There are also several of you who are asking in the chat, which I also think is important, as to see how you can get involved. And I just want to make the point that we are trying to close now the core team, but there will be a variety of different engagement possibilities. The reason why we're trying to close the core team is we also have some level of criteria that we're trying to fulfill around gender parity, as well as regional, geographic split, etc. But that doesn't mean that the core team is closed. And so if you are absolutely interested, and I saw a chat in or question in here from someone from the EU, if you are someone from the European Commission and you have asked to be involved, then clearly the EU is being involved through some of the member state engagement and the regional engagement opportunities. So but please do reach out to us, and I will ask Mimansha to put her email in the chat if you have a specific query in terms of further engagement, but there will definitely be more opportunities for engagement. So I would like to move on now to some of our other core team members who are bringing in, as I said, some of the very important parts of what we feel is specific to the resilience track. One is Tom Mitchell from Climate Kick, and I'm proud to have Tom here, being on the advisory board also of Climate Kick, around climate. So I'll start with you, Tom, and then move to Nate around so Nathaniel Matthews from the Global Resilience Partnership on Innovation, and then to gender, and then to finance. So Tom, you go first, please. 5 minutes, if possible, just a quick reflection.
Thank you, Sandrine. So good afternoon, or whatever time of the day it is. Hello to everybody. So my name is Tom Mitchell. I'm part of an organization called Climate Kick. Climate Kick is an innovation agency and community of organizations dedicated to tackling climate change through innovation. And one of the key topics that we've focused on over the last 10 years is on the resilience of the food system. And in that time, we've supported dozens of projects and startups, SMEs, businesses, community organizations, and so on, to try something new in trying to build the resilience of food systems, and to try something new, experiment and see what happens, with a sense that we don't really know at the moment exactly what we need to do to make our food systems resilient, but we do know that at the moment we're not having the type of success that we need to have. I think in doing so, also understanding that if we genuinely talking about systems, systems are inherently complex. They have multiple actors, they have multiple influences, and that they exist across scales in ways that we at times struggle to understand through simple tools. And so that many people have talked about the way in which you engage with systems. Thinking about multi-actor, multi-stakeholder, multiple perspectives in order to be able to transform systems. But often we lack the tools to do that. We lack the structures, the ways of funding, the ways of interacting that allow us to really transform systems. And so Climate Kick has had this notion, and I think many others have had it too, is that it's no good with a systemic problem just sprinkling confetti on that problem in the form of individual projects. But instead, you need to think of it as a spaghetti, one where you can pick up the strands of the spaghetti and start to untangle the ways in which the food system is built, but to do so in a way in which you have to look at multiple strands of spaghetti simultaneously. And with that, that means new tools, new structures, new ways of working, new ways of financing that I think be really important for the action track to explore. But also from a climate change angle here, I think there are some hard truths that we need to look at too, which is that just looking at resilience through the lens, for example, of the impacts of climate extremes on the food system is only one part of the problem, or one part of the challenge. We've also got the type of slow onset impacts that maybe are more insidious. You don't see them until they start to really hit whether it's desalination or slightly warmer climates on a year-on-year basis that push you beyond certain yield thresholds and so on. But also that it's very bound up in the fact that the food system itself is a big contributor of the problem. It's a big contributor of emissions in different ways, and it also has a key impact on biodiversity and on loss of species and so on. And so narrowing it down to only look at resilience, I think is equally a little bit naive, and we need to look at the connectivity across the system and the way in which you can build resilience in the context of also making other changes. But just from Climate Kick's perspective, I wanted to highlight in the remaining couple of minutes that I've got a few of the types of experiments or in some ways risks that we've been taking with our partners to see what's possible. So on the producer side, some of the innovations that we've been trying include looking at the way in which you can change access to credit. For example, by using credit guarantee schemes to allow farmers to access credit in ways they've never been able to before, and to access packages of resilience support measures at the farm level that helps to build the confidence in investing in resilience at the level of the farm, but also that produces resilience to yields over time. Looking also at the way in which you can price insurance in a way that gives credit for resilience actions at the farm level that often is lost in traditional insurance. Or thinking about anticipatory social protection and anticipatory shock response measures, which means that actually you can act in advance of a crisis rather than only in clearing up the mess afterwards. Or on the consumption side, for example, looking at bioreactive food labeling, so we can reduce food waste, that people throw away food because they think it's spoiled when actually it's perfectly good to eat, and you can change the way you appreciate that through food labeling. Or indeed to work with the big buyers within food systems, the big supermarkets, for example, who actually put in place often very punitive contracts with suppliers. And actually those contracts can be changed to create more space for resilience. We've tried things like that. And also the way in which we produce food can change. Climate Kick has been investing in lab-produced milk and lab-produced meat and many other ways in which that actually helps to build resilience in the food system, including through relocalization. And I think we need to look quite carefully at what it means to relocalize the food system to strengthen resilience, but the impact that that may have negatively on farmers.
Tom, may I ask you to conclude?
One final concluding point then, I think, is that in the context of food systems resilience, we need to innovate. We need to try new things, but we need to do that smartly in a way that is orchestrated, that we can look together at what the effect is of that innovation and do so in a way that means we can move together into a space where those systemic shifts that we need to see are in some ways designed, experimented with, seen together, tested, and we learn together. And I think the point about learning from the multiple perspectives on this action track is going to be so important. And thank you, Sandrine, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I think that your point on resilience is a very interesting one, as to resilience not being the only consideration. I think that one thing that we can say from this team is that we're very cognizant of the fact that the traditional interpretation of resilience is not what we're talking about in a post-COVID world, nor is what we're talking about when we look at the convergence of tipping points between health, climate, and also biodiversity. So yes, the interpretation of resilience is much broader in terms of the way in which we want to work forward. And we understand as we move forward that we're actually rethinking an entire system in order to ensure that people, planet, and prosperity can actually function in harmony within a holistic food system. So I would like to bring in actually Nate, because I think probably you have something to add to this, Nate, as I can see you also shaking your head.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sandrine, Salim, and Mike for this opportunity. I absolutely agree, and it's really important to recognize the sort of the multiple dimensions of resilience and recognize that it, especially when we're talking about food systems, is predicated on a healthy and functioning ecosystem. And to speak a little bit about innovation and build off of Tom's last point. I think when we think about innovation, for us, we're talking about significant positive change, and it's both a result and an outcome. But I think it's important to remember that when we're seeking innovation, it also means to take risks, because when you innovate or try something new, you need to recognize that there's a chance of failure with that. And when we bring this context to smallholder farmers or subsistence farmers, which we know there are over 500 million across the global South, taking risks and failure can easily mean the difference between life and death, even for an entire family. So farming, as we all know, is an exceptionally challenging profession and livelihood. So when we talk about innovation in food systems, it's useful to think about it at different scales and within different sectors. At a large scale farm, there's often a drive for innovation from corporations, and there's lots of innovation bringing about really positive change there in sustainably intensifying farming systems. But sometimes innovation can also be based on efficiency gains, and we should recognize that efficiency gains often result in increased use of resources. We've seen that in irrigation efficiency improvements, for example, that water consumption actually increases on a whole as it incentivizes more use of irrigation and hence more demand for resources. And for economists on the webinar, you'll know this as the Jevon paradox or Jevon's effect. So it's critical that when we think about innovation, we support innovation that stewards ecosystems and really doesn't reduce resilience. And now moving back to smallholder farmers, I think, how do we support innovation in food systems for smallholders? And GRP as a partnership of over 60 public and private organizations has done a lot of work to surface innovation. We've run a number of innovation challenges and grant programs across the Sahel, Horn of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and with small island developing states. And following on some of Tom's examples there, we've worked with Mercy Corps, for example, in rural Kenya to address the challenge of a lack of access to Sharia-compliant financial services that were stifling innovation and were critical to building resilience with smallholder farmers. It was called a Mifugo Cash program, which translates roughly to livestock money. And it was the only project of its kind that supported cooperatives of men and women to set up a partnership with banks to enable both profit and loss sharing linked to loans, reducing the risk for livestock farmers to really take risks and build innovation and resilience. And in Uganda, we work with IBM and the Weather Channel to install weather stations in schools that provide accurate weather forecasts to hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers through SMS messages to better enable planning and harvesting information for crops, thereby enabling innovation. So just in closing, just a few points. I'd like to emphasize that innovation comes in many forms. It's much bigger than technology, where people often jump to. In farming practices, it's critical that innovation works with nature to maintain healthy soils. It's about ensuring farmers, especially women, have access to tenure to invest in their farms and resilience practices. It's about getting food and agriculture to markets and consumers, which is safe and nutritious. And it's about digital connectivity as well, and getting digital services to farmers so they know what to plant, where and when, and about sharing best practice. And we clearly urgently need innovation in our food systems, but we need to ensure that it builds resilience and protects and supports ecosystems that are fundamental in food systems. And we must also be aware of the challenges, the issues of power in innovation at different scales.
Thank you so much, Nate. And I see several questions in the chat, both for you and also for Tom. What I'm going to do, actually, if everyone allows me to, is that we continue through the presentations from the panelists, and then we move into a discussion based on some of these excellent questions. So I would like to move on now to the next panelist. And I've now... because there's been a shift in my screen, I'm losing track of who's next. Sorry, hold on just a second. I need to check up. Yeah, there we go. Could I have Dr. Chiuri, please, to give a few reflections on gender?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. I hope everybody can see me. I'm on the road.
Yes, you're being driven, Dr. Chiuri. What a luxury.
Exactly. Thank you.
And it looks nice and warm where you are.
It's very warm. Yeah, thank God. I'm in the tropics. I'm driving to Nairobi from Nakuru, those of you who know Kenya.
Okay,
So,
well, welcome. Thank you for making the time for us.
yeah. So I'm standing in for Jemima, who couldn't make it. So I presume I'll do a good job on this one. And I just wanted to bring the gender and from its wider definition of men, women, boys and girls, and people of different categories in different locations, and to look at their resilience in terms of, look at the vulnerability in terms of where they are coming from. And from the gender perspective, we are looking at the cultural context in which each of these people are going to find themselves in and how they can cope with the vulnerability that they find themselves in. And we are talking about the cultural traits, the norms and the behavior patterns, sometimes religions also compromising that vulnerability or exacerbating it in some of the communities. And also the access to land, the access to knowledge, access to skills. And just as what I think it's Tom what said about the insurances, and even when you have what Nathel has talked about, the insurances, some of the banks are not ready to give everybody the insurances, especially women and the youth, simply because they don't have collateral, they don't own the assets that are needed. So we are looking at social protection also, but we also know that some of these groups, the social capital is very critical in building resilience and even the recovery and bouncing back after a threat or an experience. Then we have one of the other challenges we have is the market and control of incomes. When we think about the gender group, is that some of the farmers, the markets are very, very risky. That means they are not able to build the assets they need for resilience, just in case they have another shock, whether it is a conflict or it is climate change. And that's one of the areas that the gender aspect looks at and is very vulnerable, the accessing to reliable, profitable markets. And especially in the Kenyan context, the role of the middleman is creating another very high risk to small-scale farmers, and especially the women farmers and the youth farmers, because they are not able to access the market directly, and therefore they become very vulnerable in the situation they are in. I want to stop there and then probably answer the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chiohu. And at times it was a little bit staccato, so I hope that everyone has heard, but I think you've made some really important points. And also, we have to start to remember that apart from the fact that gender is such an important part, especially within the role of women as smallholders in rural communities, that also we shouldn't get just fixated on a gender issue, but also the cross-cutting issues around how women can be solution providers, and also how we can think about better skills and enhancing those skills. So thank you for those reflections. Can I now move over to Nisha Krishnan, who will be giving us a bit of an indication also of some thinking from WRI, but also in general around resilience and finance. Nisha.
Thanks very much, Sandrine, and thank you very much for the invitation to, I think, contribute here. I feel like the issue of finance has already come up multiple times, and in terms of the, apologies for the background noise here, but in terms of how we actually support food systems, but also actually, I think one of the things that we need to think about is the resilience of people who actually work in the food system sort of agenda, as well as the actual sort of economic aspects of this, right? And I think blended finance, especially, or finance in general, we have to think about the purpose of this, right? So whether that's it's across for different purposes, all the way from research and development, and I think Mike mentioned this in his initial presentation about whether that's about inputs, about production, is it about actual market access and transport and storage and handling? And there's finance for different aspects of this. And I think the other piece that I wanted to point out is this whole issue, the fact that depending on the scale that you're working in, whether that's smallholder farmers or all the way up to agriculture sort of processing facilities, again, I think we'll have different solutions for this. And I think one of the things that has already come up is the fact that, especially for smallholder farmers and smaller producers, we often interact with issues of financial inclusion writ large, right? So the access to actual credit markets, to the need for collateral, as Churi as well as Tom have mentioned, the fact that this actually interacts with other social protection systems. And so it's not just from a perspective of agriculture and food systems, but also from general social protection and requirements sort of for a more resilient livelihood, right? So I think there's multiple issues that we'll have to tease out. As Tom was saying, this is not, if we're talking about the system, then there are multiple aspects to this that might actually lie outside of the food system conversation. And I think we need to acknowledge that as we move forward. I mean, very specifically, at least on blended finance, it's specifically for three things, right? It is for reducing risks to commercial and private investors. It is to increase the returns to commercial investment, and it's to increase the likelihood and size of social impact. And it's often, I think, as others have pointed out, is best when there is additional support, when there's grants for actual capacity building, when there's technical assistance on demand. And I think we need to think of that as a holistic sort of package rather than one that is just for actually increasing the resilience of the food system at large. The other piece that I would also say, at least about blended finance, is that while it's a powerful tool, it's not the panacea, right? The private sector involvement in this sort of conversation needs to be sustainable in the longer term and be able to actually shift public investment into other priorities, right? So you need to have the private sector actually step up over the longer term. And so I've seen a couple of comments about how the private sector will be involved, and that's something that we probably do need to bring them in from the start. I think the other piece that I would really maybe talk about here is that, we brought up the issue of insurance, we brought up sort of the issue of credits. And I would just say that insurance, I think, has limits, right? There's only so much risk you can transfer, and there needs to be a lot of credit and investment in actually reducing risks and increasing the resilience of both everyone from the smallholder farmers to your larger agri producers. So I think there's quite a lot of where finance can step in, but it has to be supported by the other interventions that we have, whether that's in research and development, whether that's government, social protection programs. But I think there are examples out there, as Tom and Churi and Nate have already pointed out. So I'll stop there and maybe we can go into the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, again, I think that the finance situation is so important, both in understanding some of the limits to blended finance, but also seeing how more creative we can be in terms of bundling and also optimizing existing finance and getting rid of perverse subsidies and finance, because we often talk about new capital shifts, but we don't talk about eliminating the old capital shifts that are creating a lot of the problems that we have within the food system, and in particular land use and agriculture. So thank you. Sorry, I put myself on mute. Thank you all for your inputs and reflections, which have stimulated a lot of conversation, as I said, in the chat. I would now like to open up for a conversation with all of you, and also an exchange through the Q&A with those that are on the chat for the moment. I see, Tom, that you've already started to respond directly in terms of some of the questions directed towards you, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much. But I do think that there is an overarching question, which maybe all of you could come at from your perspectives around, how we truly unpack the conversation around resilience. What is the true definition of resilience? And do we give a certain weight? We have split up, as was shown by Salim and Mike, our thinking around the social, economic, and environmental impacts of resilience. Do we give certain parts of this more weight than others? We also know in some of our conversations with more of the traditional business community that for them, resilience has always equated to crop resilience and to certain types of food production resilience. And then we know those that are in war-torn areas, that resilience for them means ensuring at all costs that we have access to food when we're in the middle of shocks. So how this weighting issue, and we don't necessarily have an answer. Let's be very clear. This forum and the conversations that we're having, and Salim and I have been very clear from the outset that a lot of what we're doing right now is unpacking some of these key questions with the most important stakeholders and also with governments, because there isn't I would say, a perfect answer. And I do think that we need to give this some further thought. I don't know, Salim, if you want to come in at that point, and then Nate, I will bring you in. But this very much is coming to the question from Jose Espijuez at the EU around how we unpack resilience and what do we give more weight. Salim, do you want to start? Then Nate?
Sure. Thank you very much, Sandrine. Excellent set of presentations from our colleagues. I think we're off to a good start. So just to lay the situation we are in with our action track and more broadly with the Food System Summit is very much in listening mode. We are not telling you what we are going to do. We are telling you a few things which we are thinking of, and we are seeking advice from all of the participants in this call and from others as well on what you think are the most important things that we need to be focusing on. And hopefully then at some point in the coming months, we will then be able to, based on our listening modality inputs, try and shape something that we feel is going to be something that can be done, something achievable, that is possible. And so in my view, what we need to be thinking of now is to make sure that we're not leaving anything out that is important, that people feel strongly about all the way from the production side to the consumption side, from different geographies. And to let you know that one of the important elements in the Food Systems Summit is that a whole set of national dialogues are going to be held. Mr. David Nabarro has been given charge of this. He's already been interacting with governments, and there are a whole set of governments who will be holding national dialogues at the national level, which will be extremely important, both in terms of feeding into us as the action tracks for the summit, but even more important to identify national actions that would come out of the summit going forward. So the last point I'd like to make is that we need to be thinking not just in terms of what goes into the summit itself as an event, but what comes out of the summit at the other end in terms of the next 10 years. What do we want to do? What do we want to do that's different? And how do we think we can do it? And who can be involved in that? Not just governments, but a whole set of different stakeholders that need to be involved. And that's really something that I know Sandrine and I, and definitely Mike and my team, feel very strongly about, that we are representing all of society, hopefully, and not just governments, although governments obviously have to have a big role to play. But this is not a traditional government-led negotiation. We are not government people. We have been asked to run these action tracks, bringing in many different voices and sectors, and we hope to be able to do that. I'll stop there, Sandrine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salim. Nate?
Thank you. So thanks, Salim, also for mentioning the great work that David Nabarro is doing, which I think will be critical for this. I wanted to bring up an issue, just touching on your point, Sandrine, about resilience. And I don't think we want to get into a long discussion about the various definitions of resilience, but it's a bit of a challenge for us and for the science community in something that I see is lacking in the FAO definition. So the FAO definition talks about recovering from shocks and stresses, but I find this troubling because it misses the point of transformation. And I would strongly argue that we need to actually transform our food systems if they're to be resilient to shocks and stresses. And I would also argue that it's really not desirable for 500 million smallholder farmers to just recover from a shock or stress, because then they would just be susceptible to that next shock or stress again. And recovery may only mean, for many of them, just a return back to extreme poverty. So I think that point of transformation is something that's important for us as a group to think about. And I'd also like to hear other thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Nate, thank you for that. And I think you bring up a really good point on transformation, and then which actors need to be part of that transformative thinking. There's a question that we have, several questions on Facebook around the indigenous food systems and bringing in more consideration the stewards of the land, small landowners, et cetera. And this comes back to your question around transformation. And then by the same token, there is, and someone who's been very active on our website and on this webinar has been, someone representing the dairy producers, which some would claim are much larger scope, much bigger, and could be by some, again, seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution, in particular those that are trying to move away from dairy and from animal products to plants and more of a vegan lifestyle. So I'm going to throw this back out at you and also on the chat. This is the core of the problem, people. I mean, let's be very clear. We've got big business interests, we've got small landowners, and we also have the core interests of healthy food for healthy people and for a healthy planet. How do we square the circle on that? And I would love to have responses from all of you who think that you do actually have some solutions, because exactly as Salim has indicated, we are in listening mode. Part of what we need to do is curate those solutions, understand them, but let's be honest with ourselves. The reality check here is we are moving away from the traditional definition of resilience into a much broader definition around people, planet, and prosperity that is inclusive of taking into consideration the current existential crisis of climate and biodiversity loss. And we would be absolutely remiss not to take those into account, even if those regions who feel that the security element and the access to food within conflict zones is the most important thing for them. We need to think about how do we replenish our land as much as possible across the globe in order to feed people and not destroy the planet. That is the core thinking that I think, Salim, you agree with me on, and we have agreed is part of the premise of this resilience track. So is there someone else from the panel? And Tom, I don't know if you want to come in here or someone else from the panel who would like to reflect on this. And then also within the chat, some of those who are participating.
Yeah, Sandrine, thank you. Let me just pick up then from where you left off. I think 3 very quick points then. The first is that we have, over the last several decades, separated humanity from nature in a way that has actually compartmentalized those elements. And I think there is a real job for us to do now, identified by many, many different UN processes, that it is about living in harmony between a human system and a natural system, not separating those two. And I think at the heart of that is the way in which we've abused the soil. And that there is so much thinking and effort now going into saying, well, what is regenerative in terms of the quality of soils that helps to build the nutrition and so on, but in a way that stops that level of abuse. And I think I just wanted to point to the work that the European Union has started to do with reference to missions. And I don't know for many on the call whether you will have picked this up, but there are 5 missions now that the European Union has set, one of which is about regenerating the quality of our soils. And to do that, that means changing many, many different things and many systems, but including going back to working with more indigenous practices. And I think that nurturing of indigenous practices that many people have talked about is something that this track needs to look at quite carefully. But as others are flagging in the chat, there are many ways in which the resilience dimension and the nutrition dimension and the sustainable consumption dimensions, all of these things are interrelated. And I think the overall food systems perspective does again need to look at resilience through that angle. 2 other things very fast. When we talk about business, I think the involvement of business is really crucial because we know the way in which the large-scale structures of business and the food system have been part of that basis of abusing our soils. And we've seen many studies and documentaries around that in the last few years as well. But I think we're also missing the opportunity that we have with smaller businesses, with startups, with SMEs to be part of the solution, where the transformative possibility of our systems comes through new ways of offering services, new ways of thinking about the future, which is a business opportunity too. And I think nurturing that within some of our communities is important as well, because it can create jobs, it can create growth, and it can create wealth, but in a way that is much more sensitive to the local environment. Last point is, and I think Jury made this very clear, is the role of women entrepreneurs, of leaders, of farmers within our system is really still very undervalued. And I think our governance structures in particular at multiple scales tend to exclude women and young people from decision making. And even if women make up well in excess in many countries of half the subsistence farmers, there is a systematic exclusion and inequality in the context of decision making. And that has to change too. And so the question of governance and inequality and governance and democratic processes and so on has to also be part of the mix. I'm sorry that I'm adding more and more issues to the table, like it kind of expands and explodes, but that is the systemic approach that we need to consider.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to bring in our chief scientist, Tom Hertel, if you wouldn't mind reflecting at this point as well, especially on, there are quite a few discussion points here and questions around agroecology, the agroecology approach. Tom, you've brought up, Tom Mitchell, that is, you've brought up also the importance of defining what regenerative means. You know, clearly we need to understand what some of these indigenous practices are, how we can better replicate them, how we can take them to scale. I mean, replication, scale, and then many of you in the questions are asking also questions around, you know, how do we take into consideration localities, the specificity of key location. Maybe Tom Hertel, you want to bring in some thinking around this?
Oh, wow. What a lot of issues that we're talking about here. That's terrific. I did put in the chat box a list of all of the action tracks. So I do want, I know there were questions about nutrition, diets, other things in the chat, and that of course relates directly to some of the other action tracks. So we are focused squarely on the resilience question, and I think it's great that people are talking about challenging that FAO definition, thinking more broadly. That's exactly what we're interested in getting feedback on. I did want to also draw your attention to those who do want to provide feedback to our committee and input into our report. I put our emails, myself and Ismahan Elouafi, she's chief scientist now at FAO. We would welcome your email comments on our document. I think the question, the mutualism, this mutual interest between agriculture and the environment and ecology that has recently been elevated in the past, as has been pointed out. We had agriculture over here and monoculture, and over here we had the environment, and there was even thinking that, well, if we do this intensively enough, maybe we can spare more of the environment. Now, more of the thinking is around, and I'll put a thought piece in Dropbox, in the chat along these lines. The thinking is more around the potential mutualism, the way improved ecology can indeed support agriculture, and how agriculture can be done in a way that isn't as damaging to the ecology. So yeah, just a couple of comments. There's so much, so many good ideas floating around. I'm happy to respond to specific points.
I think there were two further thoughts that I wanted to bring up with you, and then I'd like to bring in Salim on this as well, and then Nisha also wanted to make a few points. The first is, you and I and Salim had a conversation around GDP, and I think it's really important as well that we understand the relationship, the economic relationship between the food system resilience and also have a better grasp of what are we talking about when we talk about growth and we talk about the food system itself. So I think that's really important, because we're starting to see a decoupling of the food system from growth in terms of also optimization of some practices. And then I want to bring in another question that's come in here around, how can we then rethink some of the production processes, whether it be in livestock. So we have Mutua from Kenya, who's talking about rabbit farming. We've got Donald, who's obviously talking about dairy farming. My great friend Hunter Lovins, who's a member of the Club of Rome and a member of our team, who often talks about good livestock practice actually is a positive, not a negative, if we look at resilience. Do you think that the scientific committee and yourselves are going to be able to gather some of this data and some of this case history so we truly understand the environmental and other impacts?
Well, let me take those questions in turn. On GDP and the size of agriculture, I know Salim presented a slide with the declining share of GDP, agriculture share of GDP, but the food system itself is much more than agriculture. It's a whole supply chain, and it's going back into the input supplies and forward through the whole supply chain to the food that you buy in the store. And of course, the importance of the food system as a whole is still very large, and it's increasingly complex. I think we need to be thinking about it not just in terms of crops or agriculture, but in terms of the broader food system. And that's very much the spirit of the science committee's approach to this question. On the second point, livestock systems, let me just say I was on the Zoom last night with the chief scientist at CSIRO in Australia, and he was I was asking him what they were up to these days, and they've currently got a program underway with the beef industry in Australia aimed at being carbon neutral by some very ambitious date. I can't remember what it was. And this is being facilitated by incentive payments, investment payments from the government. So to the livestock industry. So in Australia, the private sector is moving ahead in a number of these areas where the government is lagging a bit behind. They're interested in getting ahead of the curve. They're interested in presenting themselves to consumers as being environmentally friendly and taking significant action. So I found that quite exciting. Our report is constrained to including things that are peer reviewed. It's a very strict standard we've been presented with by Professor von Braun, but as these things become available, we'll certainly include them in our report. And we welcome, I noticed already there have been articles posted in science in the chat box to bring to our attention additional publications. I'm very interested in receiving those either through the chat or email. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Salim, did you want to comment, or should I let Nisha in first?
Let's get Nisha, then I can come in later.
Okay. Nisha.
Sandrine and Salim, I think one of the things that I mean, we started off this discussion on how we balance the benefits, right? Whether that's economic, environmental, or social. And I think what I would suggest, and what we've all, I think, maybe converged towards, is that the very translation, I think, as Sandrine, as you were saying, the very translation of environmental and social benefits into economic value is the crux of this, right? Yeah. Because there is exactly a need for us to value the natural capital, value the land in much more distinct and explicit terms than we have in the past. And I think this conversation about GDP is that there is a lack of the value of security, of societal security. It is not reflected in GDP value, right? And I think that's the other piece that we really need to bring out, that there is actual benefits to investing in lower intensive agriculture, if that's the idea, or whatever other piece, that there are very direct benefits to this, and explicitly addressing that in the sort of quantitative world that we have is actually something that can move this discussion forward. And for example, some of the work that we've done in the Global Commission on Adaptation is actually trying to look at the benefits, the environmental and the sort of social benefits of adapting, right? And of investing in adaptation as a way of furthering this conversation. And I think that's pretty similar to, I think, the discussion that's going on here. And there are economic studies that look at the cost benefit analysis of this. And this is where private investors would actually find revenue as well, right? So if you are trying to get private businesses to think about this, there is a way forward on this. But we can talk about that, I think, over the course of the year and what we can practically do to forward this conversation. So thank you.
Nisha, you're absolutely right in terms of ensuring that we have a value on natural capital. I mean, you know, natural capital cost accounting, the way in which we look also at the investment community and the way in which I'm part of the taxonomy process here as well. But maybe what I would add to your very good point is that many of us also, especially at the Club of Rome, don't really believe that GDP is necessarily the right value for growth. And now that new thinking around new indicators to growth is also part of this process, which is incredibly interesting. And I think something that we need to think about as we start to unpack what resilience means. And I'm just going to quickly point to a question that was in the chat around terminology and alignment around terminology. I think that definitely we need to see how much aligned we can be and say the same things and use the same words for the same things. But clearly with certain interest groups, it is increasingly difficult to do that. And our role within the resilience track is at least to be very clear as to when we unpack resilience, what do we mean by resilience and what do we mean by what we're trying to place a value on? And that is the best that we can do with all the stakeholders that we have. And then of course, we need to land that within a political scope and also try to link it up with some of the other conversations that are happening, such as COP26 in terms of the climate negotiations, as well as the biodiversity negotiations through COP15. Salim.
Yes, thank you very much, Sandrine, for making that point. I was going to do that. So in my view, our entire effort of the Food System Summit as a whole, as well as in particular, I think a priority for Action Track 5 on resilience is the unpacking not just resilience, but systems and taking a systems approach to everything, which connects the food, agriculture systems to the biodiversity, the global, the COP on biodiversity, COP15 coming up in China, and then also to the climate change COP26 coming up in November next year in Glasgow. And I think that speaks again to the point I tried to make earlier of thinking of whatever we come up with as not just a single summit statement, but a set of things that we can take forward post-summit. And to me, what is it that we want to happen after the summit is almost more important than what is it we want to talk about in the summit. The summit is going to be a talk fest, you know, lots of statements and so on. But what can we put in place? And this is where I see this forum as bringing us together with these potential actors who are interested in doing things together, that we can then, you know, give it a bigger push at the summit, but then after the summit, we can take it forward together for those of us who are interested in doing that. And I'm really interested in identifying a number of things that might be possible for us to give a boost at the summit, but then continue to do after the summit. So very much a longer term perspective rather than just looking at it as a one-off summit issue alone. Thank you. You're muted, Sandrine.
Sorry, I've got a vacuum going on downstairs, which is also creating some noise. I hope you can hear me. Yes. So thank you, Salim. Fully agreed. And I think we've had much discussion also in this track already from the outset as to how we can ensure that the life of this track continues, the thinking of this track continues, and not only that, but the action solutions that we come with are actually integrated into some of the international negotiation, the processes, the exchanges that we're seeing, so that we're completely linked up. I don't think myself, nor Salim, nor the rest of the team, including the WFP, the UN itself, really want this to be an isolated conversation that has absolutely no impact. And that means that, yes, we need, I mean, the resilience track is going to be asking some of the most difficult questions, and we're going to have to come up with some answers. And they may not be the ones that everybody wants to hear. So I think that we have to be honest in that respect. I'm just quickly looking at the Q&A, and Stephanie and Mimansha, Neil, if you have ones that you feel I specifically need to answer. But I think that there's one from Lourdes regarding, again, indigenous food systems and agroecological approaches. Clearly that we are looking at, and we will be bringing that in firmly as an important approach to addressing resilience issues. There's also a very good question, I think, from Facebook around the urbanization, growing urbanization, and how do we bring in resilient food systems within urban structures. I don't know, Tom or Nate or any of the others who are on the panel, whether you want to respond to this, knowing that Climate Kick is doing a lot of work at the city level. Maybe my only reaction would be, we need to also understand that the conversation between urban and rural is also very much a growing issue around disenfranchisement of particular people, that rural communities, in particular in Europe and the United States, feel disenfranchised. And because of that, it's also creating a huge stress on the political system and the way in which we are politicizing sustainability, climate, and other issues. And I do think that tapping into what Nisha said also post-COVID around the consciousness of people of what is essential, that food, access to food, water, and good healthcare have become the most essential parts of people's lives and livelihoods, that this is the moment where the work, not only that we're doing in the resilience track, but across the other tracks, can really fundamentally make a difference to the way people engage in the food system. And that means that we have to get better at bringing engagement both from the rural community and the urban community, so they understand the importance of the food system and the full value chain. Tom, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Just a couple of quick things. I think that what we've seen, so Climate Kick, as Sandrine said, works also with some of the most ambitious cities in the world in terms of their decarbonisation and resilience plans. And what we see in some of those cities is this, in some ways, perpetual pattern of disengagement of rural population from the production cycle of food systems. And so part of Climate Kick's work, as I mentioned at the start, has been to invest in experiments to see what happens if you try and change that. And if I'm quite honest, I think the evidence that we've seen across Climate Kick, there's been some successes and there's been some failures. So for example, the efforts to bring vertical farms within the context of the urban environment, or indeed to work on community gardening and community food production, or there's some guerrilla gardening movements or roof, there's a multitude of different ways that this can happen. Not all have been successful, but the point is that you can learn from each of them and learn from some of the failures. And so I'd be very, very pleased if we can look as part of the action track to see the ways in which urbanization in some ways of the food, that's a horrible way of putting it, but bringing aspects of the food system within the urban fabric. What has worked, what hasn't worked, and what in some ways are some universal truths that we might be able to draw in scaling up some of those successes. Because I think the connectivity of the urban population to the food system needs to be changed in such a way that we can really bring back the sense of what the consumer needs to protect.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And I think that some of this, we're getting lots of questions here. By the way, I'm super multitasking here. I'm looking at the Q&A, the chat, and my WhatsApp all at the same time to try to make sure that I'm getting grasp of what all of you are asking about. But I think, Tom, what you're speaking to as well is what many are referring to, the need also to bring in some of the new transformative thinking, some of the new demonstrations. Some of this is live. And I know that Climate Kick is doing that very much as a way to demonstrate that innovation is changing. You know, we also sitting, as I do, on many different research and innovation task forces for the European Commission and elsewhere. What we're realizing is the usual innovation and research that was happening only in an academic environment or only in a certain business environment is now actually coming out, whether it be through our experience through COVID, where people got completely involved in the food value chain in order to ensure that people had access to food. That in and of itself was a new innovation that we could think about in terms of optimization of the value chain and also ensuring that people get what they need when they need it. So I think, yeah, Nate, come on in. And then I'll continue my thought, but I think it's good to have someone else speak.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I would just say that we did some work over the last few months led by, or we supported some work led by ICAD, Professor Salim's organization and the Climate Development Knowledge Network, where we collected over 22 stories from grassroots organizations, so Voices of the Frontline initiative. And to understand what was working and what were the challenges in building resilience. And one of the key messages came out of there that the biggest impact was from COVID was on food security. And the really also emphasized the critical role of grassroots organizations in enabling food security. So just building off of what you were saying, Sandrine. So I think that, you know, understanding how we build resilient value chains. You know, for much of the global world, our value chains have been pretty resilient in the face of COVID, but certainly in more, you know, low and middle income countries, that hasn't been the case always. There's been extreme impacts, and, you know, we have on our supermarket shelves, it hasn't been an enormous impact, but we have to recognize that impacts are felt differently, and future shocks may be much more devastating.
Thank you, Nate. I want to build on that. And I also want to build on that kind of innovation cycle and the way in which we look at the full value chain, because again, creating resilience within the value chain is fundamental as well. And I want to bring in a couple of actors within the value chain that we know. And I want to see if Dr. Curie is still on, because there's an anonymous attendee that has asked a question around ensuring gender within the resilience building, and not just talking about women's land rights, but actually how do we ensure that women become part of the real economy? You know, we often, and this is the same thing that we're hearing, by the way, in terms of social workers and the way in which women are engaged in particular in emerging economies. So I don't know if someone wants to take that question. I don't know, Nisha, if WRI has done some work in terms of bringing women more into the real economy and really enhancing their role within the value chain. In many emerging markets, it's the sale of the produce, it's the production and then the sale of the produce at markets. But how do we actually scale this up and also create a decision-making loop? The other key question that I have for all of you is how do we design the right feedback loops? What is the design thinking that we need to have once we have the data or a better understanding of the data? And the reason I bring this up is also the relationship that this conversation and the outputs from this track will have with, as we said, COP26, COP15, future discussions on biodiversity, on agricultural policy, trade in the G20, and the G7, ensuring that we influence the climate negotiations, etc. So I think a design conversation is also one that we need to have once we start to think about the solutions. I don't know if there's some reflections on those questions that I've just thrown out to you. And Dr. Churi, I don't know if you're still there. No. Okay.
I'm still there.
Yes, she's there.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Go ahead, please.
Please, on the gender
Okay.
question.
Can you repeat what you said, please? Can you just?
Yes, what I wanted.
I didn't really understand.
Yeah, there was a question here.
Just repeat.
There was a question. Yes, there was a question here around how do we ensure gender within the resilience building besides just honoring women's land rights? So how do we ensure that they become part of the broader value chain, that they actually are brought into the economic system? rather than being on the outside?
Okay. Let me try and respond to that. I think one of the things that is coming out strongly that land is not the only factor when you look at resilience and vulnerability. The social context, the political and the institutional frameworks in which each group finds themselves in is very important. From where I'm sitting, the political scenarios or the political dispensation within the society is also very critical. What are the politicians, what are the policies the governments, the respective governments have put in place to ensure that women are entrenched into the whole economy and how that economy works? So land is very important, but also education becomes very important. Decision making at different levels, from the individual households all the way to the government systems, and also the institutions that the government have put in place and how those economic institutions are able to support the economic activities within the country. I think those are very critical. So when we are looking at gender, we are looking at women and men, but we're also looking at the vulnerable communities, the marginal areas, and how those marginal areas can be made productive. When you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the time the economic frameworks we have used is what the colonialists brought in, and it was extractive economies. They just pulled out whatever they wanted to get out of the economies, other than bringing in things back. And so we need to be able to ensure that even those marginal lands that can be made productive, there are systems that are looking at the potential they have. Some of them are marginal because we have made them marginal. Some of them are marginal because naturally the ecosystem makes them marginal. But when we look at the gender question, we look at it from the broader perspective of it. Not only access and managing land, but all the institutions that come along with creating resilience and sustainability, as we have talked about. Thank you. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Kira. I really appreciate that. I know it's difficult where you are right now to be fully engaged in this. So I really appreciate your answer. I think it was very comprehensive. I don't know if there's anyone else from the panel, and also in seeing some of the chat that wants to complement this point or also speak about some of the other points that I brought up. Or Salim or Mike or Stephanie. No? So maybe I can just bring in again this point that I've tried to bring in several times around, and I think many of you are navigating around it, is you know, and Nate and Tom, you've also referred to it, this and Nisha actually, this particular moment in time where we are with the COVID pandemic and the fact that food has been perceived and is a key part of our survival. And therefore the fact that we're coming back to what is essential. And I would like to come back to Stephanie actually on this point as well, because I know that the WFP is working really at the crossroads of this nexus around kind of the convergence of the tipping points, ensuring that we actually do have complementarity within the interventions. And I think it's so important as we look at the complexity of resilience that we understand that complementarity, that we understand what has worked, what hasn't worked. You know, if we could get more examples to really build on that, to look at scale, replication, etc., as we move forward, and to give some real solutions to some of those more tricky tensions that we see within the resilience building scenario. Stephanie, I don't know if you have a few thoughts there. I'm kind of putting you on the spot, sorry.
You are, that's okay. I was looking for my mic button. No, I think from WFP, we're very aware that, and we're very happy, especially to be the track or the anchor agency for track 5, because it's really, as you say, you know, resilience can be just everything. So how do we make sure that we identify the trade-offs or the issues that we need to address and really provide a solution or an option to make those food systems sustainable. The work that WFP has done, and I think that's where we try to, as the anchor agency, try to approach is, you know, what are these problems that we are looking at? And I think, John Ingram, we didn't reply to your question because I think it's more of a piece of help for our work and the thinking of, you know, what is this, of what, to what, for whom, and over what period of time. And WFP has the benefit of working both in fragile contexts and also addressing the needs of countries with fragile food systems. So you actually bring both worlds together in a sense, and the expertise and the experience that we can provide in terms of what are the problems that we need to address is in a way a starting point to be able to identify those trade-offs and the answers that we look for. But John, I think that your questions are quite, you know, on the spot because it's true. And then again, we need to address the question of hunger is the underlying, or we need to come up with a solution of how do we address the hunger problem, which gets or is intensified by many other elements that then build up this whole resilience question, where we need to really put our heads together and find all the ideas, or through the stakeholders. I know you've mentioned, you know, the private sector, indigenous organizations, rural farmers. There's the rural and the urban. Everything needs to be put together like a puzzle to make sure that we include everything and that we address all the issues to bring about a solution. Hope that was okay, Sandrine. Over.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that's more than okay. Thank you for that, Stephanie. And again, I mean, we didn't, as Salim indicated, we don't have all of the solutions today. That's what part of this process is. And that will be why we need to move and work with all of you. Again, I'm looking at the different Q&As here and some of the questions around, for example, Tom, and I'm not going to ask you to answer right now, maybe you can answer in the chat, around clear practical examples, or maybe Nate, you have this, or even Nisha, of where Indigenous farmers' knowledge and skills have also been taken on board in terms of new innovative thinking. Then I have, I think, a really good point from Sylvie from the FAO, and this is exactly what we are discussing, Sylvie, is how do you unpack the whole resilience thinking? Are we already starting in the right direction by looking at the social, environmental, and economic implications? Clearly bringing in the disaster issues, the climate issues, the conflict issues, the food threats, and overarching risk management, because part of the whole resilience thinking is also risk management. All of that needs to be integrated into our thinking as we move forward. And this comes back to the initial question from the very outset, which is, what weight then? How do you prioritize? What does this mean within a local environment? And those are the really tough questions. Clearly, we cannot answer for every single jurisdiction what that will mean. I think that if we can start to at least gather the best technical and scientific evidence to qualify what resilience might mean in practice, build that up then into core models or principles of what could be included as we move forward and propose this to governments, taking into consideration, again, as I said, the geopolitical dimension, the geographical dimension, the topographical and biosphere, biotomes dimension. I mean, all of these different aspects, which are very different. But by the same token, if we're able to at least put forward some key principles, and I know that some of this work has already been done, so we can already create or bring that in, then that will be moving in the right direction. And yes, Sylvie, that means looking at what the FAO is doing. I think that's really important. And it's looking at what the WFP is doing. It's building on what a lot of the work that's already been done by the international organizations. Salim, do you want to come in here? And then Stephanie, I think you wanted to say one more thing.
Great, thank you very much, Sandrine. I think we've got some extremely useful inputs and a very, very good participation in this event. And I want to thank everybody that has engaged with us. We will certainly want to take on board, and please feel free to get in touch with us and follow up as we go forward. We will be taking everything into account and having further discussions and consultations with a wide variety of stakeholders. Sandrine and I and others are having bilateral discussions with many different groups as well. And so we look forward to harvesting the research, the knowledge, the experience of as many different groups, stakeholders, and even individuals as are able to do so, and bring that into our sort of horizon in our thinking. And then, as Sandrine says, we will have to make some decisions as to what we think are the most viable ones for us to take forward. We hope to have in the coming months some sort of a draft that we can then share again for feedback and have an iterative process of getting sharing thoughts and getting feedback on them going forward. But we are extremely delighted by this particular event and by the inputs that we've got, and a lot of food for thought certainly for our group as we go forward. And I look forward to talking to everybody over the next coming days and weeks as we develop our program together. Sandrine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Salim. Stephanie, some lasting thoughts, and then I will conclude with a few reactions again to the chat that we're just getting now.
Sure, thank you, Sandrine. So just a thought while you were explaining, you know, how broad and how complex the resilience part is. I think it goes back to the question raised by Pat McMahon of specifics brought into the whole process. So in your work and in your engagement in this whole Food System Summit process, just remember that you have the tracks, that it's a really broad one, it's really big. And there are several levels of engagement and possibilities to really make a difference. There's the track work, but there's also, at least from the WFP perspective, we find that the country level engagement is crucial, because only through the country level engagement will you be able to really identify the specifics and the issues that really need to be addressed to make that transformation of food systems. At the broader level and the track, of course, you will have a broader vision of the food system and how that needs to be shifted. But without the country context, it will be very hard to really come up with the specifics and find those actionable solutions. Over to you, Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I think that's a really good reminder. I mean, this is ongoing, and again, it is complex. So we do need to engage with you as much as possible, but also you need to engage at your own country level. I think that we need to speak a little bit about how that can work. I'm not sure I know all the mechanisms, but clearly what we're trying to do, and I know what the UN is trying to do, is make the website a really integrated space and an exchange area where we can get more of your thinking. That also, if you want to engage, that you should let us know so that we can continue to bring us into further stakeholder engagement like this one, as we start to move down the track of filtering out some of the thinking and starting to propose some principles and some solutions moving forward. I think that there are two key points that have come out here. One is that clearly the FAO and the thinking of the FAO, and your work, Sylvie, will be, as I said, a foundational piece, as a lot of the other incredible thinking that has gone into resilience will be, the work that the GRP has done and others in this area. And I would urge you, Sylvie, even though we can't right now have this exchange, to really participate in our resilience track. I don't know if you've already been put forward as the key person. I know that there will be someone from the FAO who is actually working with us, and maybe that person needs to be you. So that is one offer. The other is that, coming back to the point on fair trade that has also been made, another really good question. And I think this is where we need to look at the landmines. You know, maybe as we close, we're not going into this blind, as I said in some of my previous statements. We know how complex the whole area around resilience is. We know how complex the world is around us right now, in particular as we move through and out, we hope soon, of COVID. And we know how complex it will be if we do not actually put in place some thoughtful thinking and solutions in order to start to create the resilience that we need. So we do feel a huge sense of responsibility in this track. However, there are specific business interests. There are specific government interests that we will have to be careful of if we want to be as holistic and systemic in our approach and truly put forward a proposal which has as its guiding light to build a resilient system. So our work is to listen, but our work is also, at least that's how I see it, Salim, and I think you do as well, Absolutely. Is to be true to what do we feel the interpretation of resilience is, which is that broader interpretation that we all brought forward in the beginning, and stay true to that and the underpinning scientific evidence and data that we have before us. Then we will let the politics do their thing. But I think it's really important that everyone realizes that at least this action track is going to stay true to that mission. And that's how Salim, myself, and Mike, and I think Stephanie and the WFP feel it, as well as the UN, in terms of the conversations we've had. So coming back to the very good point on fair trade, you know, there are, again, fair trade has been used and abused by some and has also played a very important role in other ways. We need to unpack that. We need to unpack the different mechanisms that actually enable not only the food system to be resilient, but also to communicate what truly is resilient and sustainable to the consumer. That's where the tensions are. The tension often is through abuse and use by certain interests. Again, we need to at least be cognizant that this is part of the problem. So I'm sorry if we haven't answered that question completely, but I'm not sure I know 100% what the answer is, except that I think it's a really important question to unpack and to look at in terms of the tensions. If no one has one final comment, I would like to close here. Thank you very much. I mean, we've had at least on this webinar from the beginning about 150 participants. And then on top of it, I know that through the live stream, we've also had probably another similar amount of people. It shows that there's interest. It shows that you're all engaged, and we hope that you will continue to be engaged. On behalf of the core team, I would like to thank you. And I very much hope that you will stay engaged and really join us on this incredibly exciting journey and support us in what we hope will be some really key solutions around resilience. Salim?
Thank you very much, Sandrine. There's nothing much for me to add, but just to thank you for a magnificent moderation. Well done. And all the speakers for their contributions, very, very useful and stimulating, and the participants for their questions and their engagement. And I look forward to us in continuing this engagement. This is the start of a conversation that we are very interested in continuing. We won't resolve everything, that's a given, but we will do our best to make things move forward in a positive direction. Thank you all.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Well done.